But first, Henry Louis Gates, Jr., known to his friends as Skip. He was born in the village of Piedmont, West Virginia. After graduating from Yale, he taught at Cornell and Duke. He became chairman of the Department of African American Studies at Harvard, where he now teaches. He has a new book. It is called Colored People, and it is a memoir, and I am pleased to have him here. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Why this title, Colored People?
Well, that's the title that we called ourselves in the 1950s, and this book is really, rather than an autobiography, it is a memoir of a lost era in the history of black people in this country. I mean, there was a time when we were colored, and then we became Negroes, and then we became Afro-Americans, and now most of us call ourselves African Americans.
But you believe that at some point in the near future, it might once again become colored? Because you have said, that in fact among African Americans, frequently, there is a reference to colored in talk in the privacy of their own quarters.
Oh, absolutely. I heard Charlene Hunter-Galt last summer in the Vineyard say that the term that she preferred was colored people. And once I saw Reggie Jackson on TV ask someone, was he colored? And they said, oh, I mean African American.
Yeah.
Many of us use that in the intimacy of our own culture, the sort of cultural privacy. We use this term because it's the term that we heard the most when we were kids. And I think that our children will go from, as I say in the book, from being African Americans to people of color, and once again they'll become colored people.
And what do you think of that?
Oh, I'm not invested in any of the terms. Yeah. The term that I use when I write is African American because I write about Africa as well as Africa America, as it were. But I don't think that the terms matter. I don't invest as much political meaning in these terms as some people do. And I think the fact that Jesse Jackson felt that he had to have a press conference and declare publicly that our name was changed is a sign of the frustration over our socioeconomic conditions. People think that if we can change our names, we'll have a new identity. And that's just not the way that it is. I was around, as many of us were, when we went from being Negroes to black.
Right.
And we thought that was the ultimate name, the name that would unlock all the secrets of our past. And now we're African Americans.
Yeah. In a sense, it would have a new definition, a new meaning, in a sense, and more of an identity, I guess, with people of color around
absolutely.
The world.
You see, we were African Americans 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And 150 years ago, we were Africans. Many of the earliest cultural institutions in the United States, invented by Afro-Americans, as it were called African Methodist Episcopal Church,
yeah.
the African Bethel Baptist Church, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a cycle.
Yeah.
There's a famous Pfeiffer cartoon from 1968 that says that.
Yeah. I think probably what's important, and you certainly know much more about this than I do, it is whether you elect to how you, individuals and groups, elect to call themselves, not some name given to them by some outside group.
Absolutely.
I mean, obviously the negative connotations of colored had to do with the fact it was used by people, white people in the South.
And used in a certain way, just like
in
Negro.
a prerogative way. Yeah,
Negro was
pejorative way.
Nigra.
Right.
And God, that makes my skin crawl even when I said it just now.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the fact that the act of self-naming is crucial, I think, to a group's political identity.
Piedmont, West Virginia. How large a town?
In 1950, when I was born, it had 2,500 people, 386 of whom were black. Now, according to the 1990 census, it has 1,100 people. Yeah. It's a mill town. West Vaco, the famous paper company, started in Luke, Maryland, which is just across the bridge. There are 3 towns with equal population connected by bridges, 2 in Maryland, 1 in West Virginia. I used to drive home from Yale as an undergraduate, 424 miles from New Haven to Piedmont, 423.8 in states other than West Virginia.
Yeah. One of the great stories, you wanted to go back to find what, to uncover what,
well,
what were you looking for?
My mother died 7 years ago this April, and my father's 81. I have 2 daughters, one's 14 and one's 12. And they don't really know, they didn't know my mother. And they knew nothing about the era in which I grew up. My wife and I were driving on Martin Luther King Day about 3 years ago from Boston to Lexington, Massachusetts, which is about 10 miles away. And we heard for the 10,000th time, I Have a Dream on the public radio. And my daughter yelled from the back, "What's the civil rights movement all about?" And I said, we were passing a motel, and I said, "You see that motel?" And they said, "Yeah." And I said, "I couldn't have stayed there 20 years ago, probably. Your mother could have stayed there." My wife's white.
Right.
I said, "But your mother could have stayed there with me." And I looked in the rearview mirror, and Maggie, my older daughter, looked at Liza, my younger daughter, like, Jesus, there goes another one of these incredible lies about the past. And it hadn't dawned on me. They had no more idea, despite school, despite whatever we might say at home, no more idea about the reality of the civil rights movement. And I wanted to write a book for them. So I wrote the first draft in the form of letters to them.
Right.
I went to the Rockefeller Foundation Center in northern Italy, at Bellagio, and every day I wrote them a different letter of about 20 pages describing another facet of our family life, or the life of the race, as it were, between 1950 and 1968, when I went off to college. And there was so much sex in the book that my editor suggested that the reviewers would not look favorably upon a book written in the form of letters to two little girls, so I had to rewrite it. So I spent the past year rewriting it and putting it in the first person. And all that's left is the preface, which is in the form of a letter to Maggie and Liza explaining why I wrote the book.
There's a wonderful story, in a sense, because it is so telling. And I wonder how many times this story was repeated in different circumstances in which you are being examined by the doctor. Tell me the story.
Well, I was an overweight kid, and many overweight boys, overweight adolescents, have something called a slipped epiphysis, which your ball and socket joint separates. And I happened to be at a Methodist church camp, and I felt this sort of pain, and it was a referred pain. You know, when one tooth is really infected but another one hurts? Well, hip pain is often referred to the knee. So I was tackled. When I got up, my knee hurt, and eventually I went to 3 different doctors, and it was misdiagnosed. They put torn cartilage in my knee. They speculated torn ligaments, this and that. And after about a month, progressively got worse. I was walking on crutches, and I was having lunch one day at school, at a little restaurant near our school, and I was walking back to the school, and the ball and socket completely separated. It was the most excruciating pain I ever hoped that I experienced. They rushed me to the hospital, and the surgeon, the local surgeon, Albert Schweitzer was he, looked at this. My right leg's completely rotated to the right. I'm screaming, hollering. And he said that they put a walking cast on. So they took me into the operating room, and they put a walking cast on this leg. Now, I learned later that the first sign of a broken hip is that your leg is rotated completely out. It was like your leg was floppy. Right. And while he was wrapping it, making the cast, wrapping it with these wet bandages, he started asking me questions. And he said, "Boy, I understand you want to be a doctor." This is a small county, and there weren't that many black people around, and I was fairly well known to be a good student. And I said, "Yes, sir, I do." And he said, "Are you good in sciences?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I believe I am." And he said, "Well, who discovered sterilization?" And I said, "Joseph Lister." "And who discovered DNA?" he said. And I said, "Watson and Crick." And my interview went on like this, and I thought that the guy would say, "Well, you're obviously a bright little kid.
What can I do to help you be a doctor?"
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
And instead, he looked at me long and hard, and then he walked out, and my mother was waiting outside, and he said, "The boy's problem is not physiological. The boy's problem is psychosomatic. He's an overachiever, and he has striven too hard, and he is snapped, and he's imagining this whole medical condition." And shortly after the cast dried, they stood me on my feet and demanded that I take steps across the floor, and with the ball and socket joint completely separated. I mean, I just fell flat on my face and started to cry, and I was in agony. And my mother, who loved doctors, and she wanted my older brother and me. My older brother's an oral surgeon now. She wanted us both to be doctors. I had never seen her talk back to a white person before, let alone a doctor. And she looked at this guy and told him he was crazy. She ordered them to get my clothes and to pack our bags, and we were going to go to the University Medical Center 60 miles away. It was one of the most dramatic moments in my life. And the pain abated somewhat just watching my mother's courage, because even I knew that there was something drastically wrong with my hip by this time.
What is the lasting imprint on you of growing up in Piedmont?
Well, I think that there are 2 things that come to mind. One is a great sense of warmth and nurturing. I had a very strong, stable family. The Gates family had lived there for 150 years. The Coleman family had lived there maybe 100 years. And I had a very strong mother who was a writer, who used to write out all the obituaries for all the colored people in the Potomac Valley. And we would get dressed up and go to church and watch my mother stand up and read those obituaries. And my mother also became the first colored secretary of the PTA in 1957. And again, it was a command performance. I'd sit in the front row, and I'd watch this beautiful woman read her minutes from the previous PTA meeting. And that established for me the model of language use and written language use. And my father was a great storyteller and a wonderful provider. He
Worked in the local factory, did
He worked at the paper mill,
Right.
and then was a janitor at night. He'd come home at 3:30. He would wash. The school let out at 3:30. We'd eat dinner at 4 o'clock. And then at 4:30, my father would go off to his second job. And my parents provided for my brother and me gloriously. We always had new books. We always had the nicest clothes in the school. But most of all...
Did you believe that you could be and do whatever you wanted to do, notwithstanding what some local doctor says to you about being an overachiever?
Anything.
Nothing was impossible.
No, only white racism
Yeah.
could stop us. Only white racism could slow us down. It couldn't stop us.
How is it different today in Piedmont?
Well, in Piedmont, most of the people my age live in the county seat. Most of the people my age that I graduated with have moved to the county seat 5 miles away because the school's consolidated. And many of my friends don't want their kids to ride buses on these craggly mountain roads. So there are 1,100 people there. There are a lot of lower-class whites there, and that was very different. So there's no community center. Basketball was everything. Basketball in the school. They were the things that united the community. And that and the colored mill picnic.
Yes, and they stopped having the picnic because the whites wouldn't attend the picnic?
No, they stopped having the colored mill picnic because the mill was afraid that the United States Civil Rights Commission was going to slap a suit on them in 1970.
Right.
Some friends and I in 1968 integrated the local nightclub for college students, which we called the Swordfish in the book. And we shut it down. We were thrown out. We were the first blacks to try to go in there other than the entertainment. They threw my friend Roland Fisher up against the wall. They threw us all out into the parking lot. And the following Monday, we called the State Human Rights Commission. They came and they shut this place down. And right after that, the mill announced that they were no longer going to have segregated mill picnics. And I remember my Aunt Marguerite saying, this is not what Dr. King died for, that we did this voluntarily. This was not segregation. We all hated segregation, but the fact that we could associate willingly going to our own churches, or in this case having our own picnic, was not something that anyone dreamed would be shut down. And so what I tried to capture in the book was this sense of loss, the passing of an era, both for my daughters, but also, I think, for me, and the working out of the passing of my parents, my mother's death. It's very much a book. It's dedicated to my parents, but it's very much a book about my mother.
Your mother seems to be the dominant influence on your life.
Absolutely. I mean, my mother and I were close. I remember one day after my mother died, my father and I were driving back from the cemetery, which is just outside of Kaiser, and he looked at a big tree. I mean, the trees everywhere, and where I grew up. And he said, "You see that tree?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "You know, I loved you and your brother, but not like your mother. If she thought that tree was offensive to you, she would have stopped the car and jumped out and shaken her fist at that tree." But my mother, mother was language for me. My mother shaped my sense of language and my sense of self.
An enormous dignity.
Tremendous dignity. And every day, virtually, in one way or another, my mother told my brother and me that we were both smart and beautiful. And, you know, maybe she got 1 out of 2 right.
Well, I mean, my mother used to tell me the same thing. And when you're an only child, boy, you tend to believe that stuff.
But I realized in the writing of this book that I was also writing it because my mother abandoned us psychologically, when I was 12. My mother went through a severe menopause, which led to a huge hormonal imbalance, which no doctor could quite ever restore again. And so my mother became quite depressive. And a fair way to say it, I think, is that she abandoned herself. This vital, dynamic, dignified person I'd known for 12 years left. I mean, there were remnants, and you could see flashes, but she never was quite the same. And about that time, for reasons that I couldn't remember, I became a born-again Christian. And it was only last September 16th, my birthday, after the book was in its final form, quote-unquote, that I realized why I had become a born-again Christian. I was sitting on a stool in my kitchen with my 2 best friends plus my wife, and I crossed my legs. We were drinking champagne. I crossed my legs, and I had this flashback. It was amazing. I remembered that I was an obsessive kid. I always ate the same breakfast. I woke up at the same time, and I always crossed my legs right over left. And one Sunday, I crossed my legs defiantly left over right, and basically dared the cosmic order to do something about it. And 3 hours later, they took my mother to the hospital. And I took responsibility for that.
So you said you had to get right with God in order to take care of your mother.
I went upstairs after they took my mother to the hospital, and I prayed, got on my knees, and I prayed, and I told God that if he just let my mother live and come home from the hospital, I would give my life to Christ. And a week later, I joined the church. 2 days later, my mother came back from the hospital.
It'll make you a believer, won't it?
Well, I was certainly was. And for 2 years, I didn't play cards. I didn't go to basketball games. I didn't go to dances, and I loved to dance.
Yeah.
And I did not, as to quote Jimmy Carter, lust in my heart. I didn't even know what lust in my heart was, but I wouldn't have done it if I had known.
Let me fast forward to Cornell, then Yale, honored graduate, summa cum laude, I remember, from Yale. And then you went to Duke University, where you were teaching there. You were always controversial at Duke. Why did you leave?
Well, I felt...
Other than the fact that to come to Harvard is a terrific opportunity, and there was a moribund Department of African American Studies, and it needed somebody to come in there and shake it up and give it all of its potential that was waiting to be stimulated.
Well, I went to Duke as part of the regeneration of the English department, led by people like Stanley Fish and Barbara Herrnstein Smith and several other major figures in English. Duke has one of the 2 or 3 best English departments in the world right now. And Stanley Fish and Frederick Jameson, the great Marxist critic, had attracted so much flack from the right. And I became the junior lightning rod for Stanley Fish. I mean, the right there identified me as this left-wing, multicultural madman. And of course, anyone who bothered to read me would know that I'm very much, I mean, left of center, but just left of center, though I'm a proponent of multiculturalism. They made me up. I mean, rather than read me, they invented someone that they could hate. I'd been brought there by the administration to at least think about starting Afro-American studies, and they decided that I was too controversial presence on campus. So Harvard asked me to come. And I realized when I talked to the administrators there that they made me a very generous offer. In fact, the offer to stay at Duke was much more generous than the offer to leave. But what they couldn't offer me was the opportunity to build my own department.
Yeah. And boy, are you building. You've got Cornell West joining you, and I don't know who else you're about to steal.
I'm trying
what other universities you're going to make unhappy like you did Princeton. But
well, hiring Cornell West, I think, was the most satisfying event of my chairmanship. Cornell West is a brilliant intellectual, foremost African-American intellectual, and a very dear friend. And I can't wait to walk past the name tag on the door every day that says Cornell West, just next to Anthony Appiah, the most brilliant African philosopher.
Yeah.
I think we'd like to hire a poet.
You just want to
next.
build, what, a hall of fame of the great African-American intellectuals writing and thinking today in this country?
Well, my metaphor is the dream team, and I'm the player coach of the dream team. Now, actually, what my motto is the replication of Howard University in the 20s and 30s when Sterling Brown was there and Alain Locke was there and
great
Charles
literary figures were there.
Right, Charles Hamilton
was
Houston.
there.
Right. Will be exciting.
What happened to Howard? Did it lose it?
Well, what happened to Howard was integration.
Yeah.
I mean, many of us, Cornell West and I
went somewhere else.
We would have met at Howard 10 years before. Instead, we met at Harvard and Yale.
All right, let me make one programming note. We promised that we would have Spike Lee here on tape. What we'll do is we'll give you Spike Lee next week because I want to continue this conversation, and we'll get to Gans Babalu a little bit later in this program. But Spike is on tape, and that interview will take place. And by that time, we'll know what happens between the Knicks and the Pacers. So I continue here with Skip Gates. Because a whole lot of issues I want to talk about, and you are right there in the forefront of them. But you're trying to, why do we need a department of African American studies?
Because the last vestige of racism, white racism in the West, will be intellectual racism. When most white people look at black people, they don't think there's a philosopher. They don't think there's a literary critic. They don't think there's a brilliant artist. They think, at best, there is an athlete. There is a basketball player, a football player, an entertainer, or a manual labor.
Right.
We don't enjoy the respect for our intellectual achievements. You know something?
Well, why is that, Skip? I mean, who's to blame for that, and why is it?
Well, the structures of white racism are to blame. I did an essay for Sports Illustrated 2 years ago for their special 20th anniversary issue of the, from the time they did the special, glorious special issue called The Black Athlete. And so I had their research department. I had a hunch. I had the research department tell me how many black professional athletes, people who earn their living from professional sports, there are in the United States. So I'm going to ask you, how many black professional athletes do you think? Now, there are 30 million black Americans.
How many black professional athletes earn their living?
In all sports, including hockey and golf.
500.
1,200.
1,200.
But I was in the colored VFW in Piedmont, West Virginia, right before I wrote this essay. I put $5 on the bar. This is after people were pretty much in their cups. And I said, how many black professional athletes? One guy said, 100,000.
Yeah.
Then people said, no, 10,000, 20,000. Do you know that there are 5 times more black dentists than professional athletes? There are 15 times more black doctors than professional athletes.
And how many black colonels and majors and generals in the Army?
But you ask the average person in America, black or white, and they think that there are 100 times more black athletes.
But still, that's begging the question. I mean, we need a Department of African American Studies in order to show us how many doctors and lawyers and non-athletes there are who are African Americans who are making significant contributions to our society. I mean, why can't you do that in terms of part of the department, the Department of History at Harvard University, without having your own separate little department?
Well, the reason that you can't is this. We need a department that is devoted to establishing the facts of the black experience, A, and then disseminating those facts.
But why? It's not being done now because of white racism? I mean, white racism hadn't stopped you from writing all the books you've written.
No.
Well, 3 of them, in fact.
Right.
4. Okay. It hasn't stopped Cornel West. It hasn't stopped Toni Morrison. It hasn't stopped a whole lot of other people.
And we're all
who made brilliant contributions. Go ahead.
And we're all in Afro-American Studies department.
Well, you are, but that had nothing to do with the quality of your work, the fact that you were in a department somewhere. I don't think. I mean, tell me why I'm wrong.
No,
I mean,
but
you don't need Harvard to be Skip Gates.
No, it doesn't have to do...
You needed your mother to be Skip Gates.
Right. But to be an academic, I need institutional support, right?
Right.
Now, the question is, could I do the same thing in the English department that I do in the Department of Afro-American Studies? And the answer is no.
Right.
The reason is this. If I'm teaching a course in the English department, if my appointment's only in the English department, I'm probably going to teach 2 courses on white Western or American literature and 2 courses on Afro-American literature. Yeah. And the 2 courses in white Western literature will be integrated courses. In a course on the history of the American novel, I could maybe teach 2 or 3 or 4 black novelists. In a course in Afro-American studies, I teach 12 to 15. Secondly, new subject matters birth new methodologies.
So, but you were saying by that, in terms of taking note of that it's important for, what's the makeup of the student composition in a class taught by you in the African American Studies? Let's say you're teaching African American novelists. What's the makeup? All black? All African American? Or 50-50 African American white?
Well, if I'm teaching a lecture course, well, I'll give you an example. Last year...
I'm getting at the point is it only the students that benefit this? Is it only the students who are being able to absorb this rich cultural experience that therefore gets at the heart of what separates us and develops self-esteem and a sense of the long history that so defines?
No, not at all. Black studies is not for black kids any more than white studies, as it were, is for white kids.
And not all of the professors are African American either.
That's right. That's what distinguishes us from other departments. Now, to answer your question, most of the people who take Afro-American Studies courses at historically white schools are white kids.
Right.
Now, most of our concentrators, that's the Harvard word for majors, will be black.
Right.
Maybe 2/3. But more and more white kids see the necessity of knowing about African-American culture because that's a fundamental part of their heritage. I would say, if anything, Afro-American Studies is more needed by white people in America than even black people, but black people need it too. I like to see all the kids who go to college in America take African-American history and literature.
Yeah. Which gets me to this question. Is at heart the problem of racism the absence of an awareness of the contributions of African Americans, and B, the absence of an appreciation of the culture of African Americans?
No. The fundamental cause of American racism is economics. The fundamental cause of racism, period, is economics. There's no doubt about that. You see, what happens is there's an economic relationship that needs to be justified. Then you say, this person whom I need to exploit is innately or biologically or naturally inferior. I didn't do it, God did it. So that these Africans, for example, let's say it's 1500, and we need to develop the New World, or 1600 or 1700. And we look around all the world's people, we see this huge body of human beings on the continent of Africa. They have no gunpowder, no way to defend themselves. They are exploitable. They are there are indigenous forms of African slavery. That means that I could go and buy them, ship them to the New World, buy them from African slaveholders, ship them to the New World, and exploit them. Then I'm going to write philosophical treatises explaining that this is, basically, I'm doing these people a favor. We are sending them to the University of Slavery. The best thing that can happen to them is to Christianize them, enslave them, ship them to the New World, where they will be better than the heathens they were in Africa. And a whole elaborate mechanism was established to justify the slave trade. And what we're seeing when I can't get a taxi on 42nd Street going uptown, what we're seeing when I can't be buzzed into a jewelry shop on the east side is the legacy.
Has that happened to you?
Sure, of course. It's happened to all black people.
You show up dressed like you are now.
I show up
looking very much the chairman of the department.
I can have a tuxedo on.
And they're not going to let you in.
No, they look at me like, what do you want?
Right.
Of course. And, but to say that racism impacts upon a black intellectual such as Cornel West in the same way that it does a person who lives in Bed-Stuy is dishonest.
Right.
But to say that we don't suffer racism because we have degrees from Harvard or wherever is also rubbish. Malcolm X used to say, what's a white racist called a black man with a PhD? And the answer is a nigger. And that's still the case. And we have to fight that by changing the economic relationships between the large segment of the black community and the large segment of the American population.
And if you change that economic relationship, we will see the erosion and withering away of racism?
Slowly. We will.
Slowly is 100 years? Slowly is how long?
Slowly is maybe 100 years. Yeah. But we can't do that only. We also have to teach all Americans about the intellectual and artistic attainments of black people.
Has it also been translated to other ethnic groups in America who've come here, whether they come as immigrants to work?
Well, if they're white immigrants.
The kind of racism against them?
If they're white immigrants, one of the ways that white immigrants become Americans is to hate black people. I mean, it's to adopt the heritage of racism that permeates the society. For other immigrants of color, of course they suffer in that way. Black immigrants do. But they have different heritages to draw upon. I'll give you an example. The Haitians in Boston. Boston's full of Haitian people, large Haitian community. Many of them are taking over the taxi industries. Now, they have intact familial structures, intact belief systems, intact entrepreneurial structures that they are able to draw upon. So they don't come here with this legacy of slavery, such as we suffer from. They come here believing that they can go into business and pool their resources, and that's what we have to do. Look, that's why I voted for Bill Clinton.
Why?
I voted for Bill Clinton because he promised that he would address the economic differentials that separated black people from white people, poor people from wealthier people. And that comprehensive jobs program, as part of what the National Urban League calls the equivalent of the Marshall Plan for the cities, is exactly what we need to begin to address.
So you're happy with Bill Clinton's presidency so far? Because he is committed to a jobs program.
No, I'm not happy with Bill Clinton's presidency so far.
Why not? Well, for foreign policy, we had Randall Robinson here recently who said he was the worst foreign policy president in the last 18 years.
Well, I'm disgusted with the policies toward Bosnia and toward Haiti.
I just want, those things are obvious, and Haiti, obvious. Speak to what else it is, because you brought it up, you voted for him. And here is Bill Clinton, who probably is more empathetic.
No question.
With African Americans than anybody, anybody in public life, as far as I know, in terms of a mainstream politician.
He's more comfortable.
That's why I said empathetic. Comfortable.
His body language has never been more natural body language around black people in the White House in the history of this country.
And so what's the problem?
Well, the problem is this, the fact that he has not enunciated a comprehensive plan that will address the cause of poverty. They had the jobs program, which died in the Congress. Then now
that was the economic stimulus program died in the Congress.
That's
because he will say that the jobs program is not dead, and in fact, what his economic program is about is a jobs program. And then he will say, and Robert Reich from Harvard will also say, they're creating jobs, and they are.
Yeah, they are, but they're not addressing it systematically. We need to have a clearly defined program that addresses this matter systematically, that lets everyone know that this is the cause of so much crime in this country. This is the cause of so much social misery in this country. And these aren't inherently bad people. These are people who are deprived. These are people who are warped and have been warped by the system. I think he made a noble effort at the beginning, but I think that he failed to enunciate it properly, to say, like, the equivalent of the war on poverty. Remember Lyndon Johnson's great war on poverty?
Or a Marshall Plan, or going to the moon, or whatever.
You got it.
Yeah, but as soon as you say that, you got people who are saying, why hasn't he done the same thing with respect to AIDS? And why hasn't he done the same thing with 16 other areas of great concern in American public life?
Sure, but there's nothing more important than getting our people back to work. Everything else flows from economic relationships. The health plan, for instance, I think is very important. It remains to be seen
whatever variation
it will survive.
Yes.
But I don't think it's
and your guess is as good as anybody else's.
Absolutely. But I don't think it's more important than jobs. I mean, even welfare reform.
I agree.
Welfare reform.
Because jobs also has to do, in my judgment, jobs has to do with dignity.
That's right.
You know?
And ultimately with health programs.
And also the cohesiveness of the family and all those values that come out of a family.
And so many demagogues are able to exploit the situation on the right and on the left.
Right, you bet.
In the black community and the white community.
Political correctness. You have written that you hope this debate is waning.
That's right. Because I don't think it ever was a real problem.
Well, you certainly could have fooled a lot of people. I mean, they thought you were right there.
Being politically correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Duke they did.
Exactly.
Right.
But the idea is that you, tell me how you feel about it.
Well, I think that it was...
And why you think it's important that it wane.
It was, the political correctness scare was created by the right because they were threatened that so many women and people of color were moving into the academy. That's it. They were threatened that Toni Morrison is now required reading in every English department in the United States, as is Zora Neale Hurston. They were threatened that if you're a person of color or a woman, there's never been a better time to be in the academy as a professor. The hegemony of white males is over, and that's a good thing. It's much better. The old boy network has been thrown out, and now we have a new system. The fact that it was conceivable 10 years ago to teach a history of American literature and not teach any black writers or writers of color or women is ridiculous. It was embarrassing, and the whole country should have been embarrassed about that. The school district in Florida, I believe, that just adopted this policy that all students would have to declare that America is the greatest civilization in the history of the world. I mean, that's embarrassing. It's the last-ditch effort to restore the world to that nostalgic never land.
But it seemed to me that some people in this debate, you know, and I hope it's waning too, some people in this debate went, as inevitably they will do, went to the extreme of sort of wanting to deny sort of Eurocentrism at all, wanting to deny any sense of the history, the other side.
Well,
in other words, why can't you raise the contribution of part without denying the contribution of the other?
Well, I think that many of us, centrists, that you might want to think of it, that's exactly what we're trying to do. But make no mistake about it.
But it's never been defined that way, has it?
No,
I mean, I've had Cornel West, your friend of mine here, and with Arthur Schlesinger, I mean, all kinds of debates, and people at that intellectual level seem to be speaking past each other.
Well, I don't think that that's necessarily, it doesn't have to be that way, I'm trying to say.
Right.
We always have to make choices. Look, if you look at when did you graduate from college?
1964.
If you looked at the survey course at Duke in 1964 in American literature and the survey course at Duke in 1994, they're very different courses. But if you look at it in 1974, before multiculturalism, they would be different courses too. What I'm trying to say is that we've always made choices about the canon, even when white males dominated. The only difference now is that it's people of color and women who are making the choices.
You said, I think, I'd like to think of the PC, political correctness debate, as waning. I said this in a speech, and I, for one, won't be sorry to see it go. To black folks dealing with 44.8% of children in poverty and with young men between 18 and 25 twice as likely to go to jail or be in the prison system as college, the PC debate is what interior design is to a homeless person.
That's right, absolutely.
And I suspect that the vast majority of African Americans would say amen to that.
Right. Look, it's people like Pat Buchanan have used the culture wars as a screen to attempt to create fear about larger social change in this country, economic change. Look,
because they view it as some coming cultural war.
That's right. Well, they view it as the Vandals and the Visigoths pillaging Washington and New York and Los Angeles, and that's just not the way it is. Look, it's very important on one level that 17 courses at Yale last year taught Zora Neale Hurston, but on the other hand, this revolution in the American Academy is occurring precisely when we have more black people and more black children particularly living beneath the poverty level than we ever had before.
Let me talk about African Americans criticizing African Americans.
Okay. Oh, I'd never do that myself.
Well, I also want to talk about you and what you say about African Americans and Jewish Americans as well, because you wrote a whole big piece about that, correct?
That's right.
All right, we'll get to that in a minute. But there are some people are wondering where you are and others in this debate when some of the statements are made by people like Khalid Muhammad, the former associate of Minister Farrakhan. Where are you in this debate, and what are you saying about some of the things that they are saying?
Well, I'm saying...
I mean, are you scared to criticize other African Americans?
Well, I don't think that anybody has accused me of being scared to criticize other African Americans.
No, they haven't, no.
And, you know, we're doing this right after Khalid Muhammad was the attempted...
he was shot in the foot.
Shot in the foot.
Right.
And
I assume they tried to kill him. I don't know. I don't know the intention.
But I think that that's terrible. I mean, I want to say that.
I do too.
For all my disagreements.
But everybody does, don't they? I mean...
Well, I hope so.
You know. But that's not what he said about Ferguson on the LIE.
No.
I mean, on the Long Island Express.
Right.
Long Island Railroad.
That's another matter.
All right.
Black American intellectuals have always disagreed. We have always criticized each other in public, going back to the 1840s and 1850s.
Intellectuals?
Intellectuals, with Frederick Douglass and other black intellectuals, and Martin Delany, over whether we should all go back to Africa. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington at the turn of the century, and the list goes on. Criticism is good. Public criticism is necessary to the progress of a people.
I invite you here to come with Minister Farrakhan to debate the subjects.
I would love to do that.
You would love to do that.
I would love to do that.
You know, and just really have at some of the things that he is saying, because he's clearly, whatever you say about him, he is finding an audience that's listening to him.
Listen, I think that Minister Farrakhan is a brilliant and charismatic man. I wrote this in the New York Times a few months ago. But I think that he speaks for and utters for an enormous amount of black people the deep sense of rage that they feel at the socioeconomic conditions that plague our community. But I think that Minister Farrakhan corrupts that sense of outrage by scapegoating other ethnic groups, particularly the Jews.
And let me just close on that. So what's your sense of what's happened to the relationship between African Americans and Jewish Americans?
Well, I think that two things have happened. One, I think that our interests continue to overlap in some areas, but they diverge in some areas. And I think those areas of divergence have created so much animosity that the alliance has fallen apart. And many of us, such as Cornell and me, are busy trying to, with other Jewish intellectuals, trying to put that back together. Secondly, I think that people like the Nation of Islam, organizations such as the Nation, have been trying to scapegoat the Jews in order to keep those traditional alliances from being put back together.
Colored people, Henry Louis Gates, Jr., from Harvard University via Piedmont, West Virginia. Great to have you.
Thank you.
We'll be right back. Stay with us.